The three black SUVs appeared at the end of the gravel driveway just as dawn broke over the fields, their windows tinted so dark they looked like moving shadows against the pink-streaked sky. Raina Harlow stood on the sagging porch of the farmhouse she'd owned for exactly 48 hours, her hands trembling as she gripped the splintered railing. At 58 years old, she'd survived a husband's betrayal, a daughter's abandonment, and the slow erosion of every dream she'd ever held. But the sight of armed men emerging from those vehicles, their tactical gear stark against the overgrown grass, sent a fear through her chest she hadn't felt since the night Marcus walked out. The lead man approached with purposeful strides, his hand resting on something at his belt. Behind him, others fanned out their movements, coordinated in a way that spoke of military training. One carried equipment she didn't recognize. Another spoke into a radio clipped to his shoulder. Raina's breath caught. She'd known the property was cheap for a reason. She'd known something about this abandoned farm had kept other buyers away. But standing there in yesterday's clothes, her salt and pepper hair still unbrushed, watching these men converge on her last desperate gamble at stability, she understood that knowledge and preparation were entirely different things. The man reached the porch steps. His eyes gray and assessing took in the peeling paint, the broken windows she'd covered with cardboard, the desperation that must have been written across her face. He opened his mouth to speak, and Raina's mind lurched backward, pulled by panic and exhaustion, into the memory of how she'd arrived at this moment standing between armed strangers and the only roof she had left. 48 hours earlier, the eviction notice had arrived on a Tuesday morning in June, delivered by a landlord who wouldn't meet her eyes. Raina had read it 3 times, sitting at her tiny kitchen table in the apartment complex where cigarette smoke seeped through the walls and her neighbors' arguments punctuated every night. 14 days to vacate the premises. The words blurred as tears she refused to let fall burned behind her eyes. The stack of unpaid bills sat beside the notice, a monument to every month she'd juggled which crisis to address first. Rent or electricity, food or medication. The part-time nursing shifts at the county clinic paid enough to keep her from homelessness, but just barely. At 55, she'd been too old for most hospitals to hire full-time. Her resume gap, from the years spent caring for Claudia counting against her, more than her decades of experience counted for anything. She'd spread her bank statement across the table with hands that had steadied countless IV lines, but now shook with the arithmetic of survival. $3,200. Everything she'd saved in 10 years of clawing her way back from the wreckage Marcus had left behind. The apartment around her felt suffocating in its familiarity. 400 square feet of peeling linoleum and water-stained ceiling tiles. The bedroom where she'd lain awake so many nights listening to other people's lives through walls thin as paper. The kitchenette where she'd taught herself to make meals from whatever the food bank had available. The bathroom mirror that showed her a woman she barely recognized anymore, all sharp angles and exhaustion, the softness she'd once carried worn away by years of surviving alone. She'd pulled out her laptop searching rental listings with the sick knowledge that nothing in her price range would accept her application. Bad credit from the debts Marcus had left in her name. No references from landlords who'd watched her scrape by month after month. The listings she could afford were in neighborhoods where gunshots punctuated the evenings, where she'd seen women her age walking to the bus stop with their eyes fixed straight ahead, radiating the careful invisibility of those who couldn't afford to be noticed. Her finger had hesitated over the mouse about to close the browser when a different advertisement caught her attention. County tax auction, real estate seized for unpaid taxes. The listing looked almost accidental among the rental properties, a bureaucratic mistake that had wandered into the wrong search results. She'd clicked anyway, more from exhaustion than hope. The photograph showed a 2-story farmhouse with white paint weathered to gray, surrounded by overgrown fields that stretched toward tree lines dark with summer growth. 15 acres in Pine Creek, Miller County. A red barn with a sagging roof. Outbuildings barely visible through tall grass. The house itself looked like it had been abandoned mid-sentence, as if its occupants had simply stopped coming home one day and never returned. Starting bid $2,000. Raina had stared at that number until the screen blurred. $2,000 for 15 acres and a house. It was impossible. It was insane. There had to be something catastrophically wrong with the property, some nightmare of contamination or structural failure that made it worthless. But $2,000 was less than 2 months' rent on the apartment she was about to lose. She dug deeper, following links to the county assessor's website, piecing together the property's history from bureaucratic fragments. The farmhouse had been built in 1910, renovated in the 1970s. 1,800 square feet, 3 bedrooms, well and septic system. The last owner, a man named William Hayes, had died in 2013. The property had passed to an heir who'd never occupied it, never paid the taxes, let it sit empty for 13 years until the county finally moved to reclaim it. Pine Creek was 40 minutes from the city, far enough that Raina could afford the gas if she was careful. The property sat in decent school district territory, though that hardly mattered now. Claudia was 28 years old and hadn't spoken to her mother in 8 years. Raina had closed the laptop and sat in the silence of her condemned apartment, feeling the weight of every choice that had led her here. Marcus leaving had been the first collapse, the foundation cracking beneath everything she'd built. His affair with a woman barely older than their daughter. His departure in the middle of the night, taking the car they'd bought together, emptying their joint account, leaving her with debts she hadn't known existed, and a daughter who'd watched it all happen. Claudia's face that morning, staring at the note Marcus had left on the kitchen counter. 20 years old, home from college for the summer, and the careful distance she'd been building between herself and her mother had calcified into something harder in that moment. As if Marcus leaving was somehow Raina's fault. As if loving the wrong man made her complicit in his betrayal. The fight had started small, the way these things always did. Claudia asking why Raina hadn't seen the signs. Raina trying to explain that love made you blind to what you didn't want to see. Claudia's voice rising, all the resentments of her childhood pouring out. The times Raina had worked double shifts and missed school plays. The boyfriends Raina had dated after the divorce, trying to fill the void Marcus had left. The way Raina had clung too tight, needed too much, asked Claudia to be her emotional support when she should have been protecting her daughter from her own pain. The words Raina had thrown back sharp with hurt. Claudia's ingratitude. Didn't she understand the sacrifices Raina had made, the life she'd given up to raise her daughter alone? And then Claudia was packing, shoving clothes into a duffel bag with furious efficiency. Raina standing in the doorway of her daughter's childhood bedroom, begging her to stay, to talk this through, to not leave like Marcus had left. But Claudia had pushed past her and the door had closed, and the silence that followed had lasted 8 years. 8 years of phone calls that went to voicemail. Birthday cards returned unopened. The Facebook page Claudia had blocked her from viewing. The friends who'd told Raina awkwardly that Claudia was doing well, living in another state, working in marketing, dating someone named Travis or Trevor or something equally forgettable. Information delivered with the careful neutrality of people who didn't want to choose sides. Raina had spent those years working, surviving, trying to convince herself that Claudia would come back eventually. That time would soften whatever wounds they'd inflicted on each other. That her daughter would realize one day that Raina had only ever tried to do her best. But the letter that arrived last week had shattered even that fragile hope. The envelope had been addressed in Claudia's handwriting, precise and careful. Raina's hands had shaken opening it, 8 years of longing and hurt condensing into the moment before she unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Mom, I'm pregnant. 7 months. The father left when he found out. I don't have anywhere to go. I know I don't have the right to ask, but I need help. I need a place to stay until I figure things out. I'm sorry it took this long to reach out. Claudia. No phone number, no return address. Just a post office box in a town 300 miles away, and a request that felt more like an ultimatum. Help me, but don't expect an apology. Give me shelter, but don't ask for explanations. Be my mother when I need you, but on my terms, with my walls still intact. Raina had read the letter 5 times before the tears came. Then she'd torn it into pieces, her hands moving with an anger that surprised her. 8 years of silence. And this was what brought Claudia back. Not love, not reconciliation, just desperate pragmatic need. She'd thrown the pieces away, poured herself a glass of water because she'd stopped keeping alcohol in the apartment years ago, and sat at her kitchen table until her hands stopped shaking. By morning she'd retrieved the pieces from the trash, taped them back together with trembling fingers, and hidden the letter in her nightstand drawer. Because despite everything, despite the hurt and the anger and the years of silence, Claudia was still her daughter. And if she came back even for the wrong reasons, Raina would take it. She'd take whatever fragments of relationship her daughter was willing to offer, because the alternative was dying alone without ever seeing Claudia's face again. But first she needed a place for them both to go. The farmhouse auction was scheduled for Thursday morning at the county courthouse. Raina had called in sick to work, driven her decade-old Honda through roads that grew increasingly rural as she left the city behind. Pine Creek turned out to be one of those towns that existed more in memory than present tense, its main street lined with shops that had closed during some previous economic collapse and never reopened. The courthouse sat at the center, a solid brick building that had probably looked impressive in 1950 and now just looked tired. Inside, the auction room smelled like old coffee and bureaucratic indifference. Folding chairs faced a podium where a man in a rumpled suit shuffled papers. The crowd was sparse, mostly men in their 40s and 50s dressed like they'd come straight from construction sites or farm equipment dealerships. They talked among themselves, voices low, occasionally glancing at Raina, with the mild curiosity of people encountering something out of place. She'd taken a seat in the back, clutching the envelope containing her cashier's check, trying to look less terrified than she felt. The auctioneer worked through several properties before reaching the Hayes farm. Commercial lots went for tens of thousands. A small house in the next county over attracted bidding from 3 different contractors. Then the auctioneer's voice cut through Raina's anxiety with practiced efficiency. Pine Creek Farmstead, 15 acres with house and outbuildings seized for unpaid taxes. Property sold as is, all inspections waived. Starting bid $2,000. Raina's hand had gone up before she could think better of it, her bidding paddle trembling. "We have 2,000 from bidder 47. The auctioneer's eyes scanned the room. "Do I hear 2,100?" Silence. The men who'd been so active in previous auctions sat motionless, their disinterest so complete it felt deliberate. Raina had lowered her paddle, certain someone would outbid her, waiting for the room to erupt with competition. Going once. The auctioneer paused. Going twice. Still nothing. One of the contractors caught her eye and gave a small shake of his head, a gesture that might have been warning or pity. Sold to bidder 47 for $2,000. Raina had signed the paperwork in a daze, watching her bank balance drop to $1,200 as she transferred the funds. The county clerk, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, had slid the deed across the counter with an expression Raina couldn't quite read. The Anderson place. The woman's voice was quiet, almost confidential. "You know there's a reason nobody bid against you." Raina's hands had frozen on the deed. "What do you mean, Mrs. Patterson?" her name tag read. The clerk glanced around as if checking who might be listening. "That property's got a strange history. Robert Hayes was an odd man kept to himself. Military background, they said. People reported unusual activity out there for years. Strange vehicles coming and going at night. Equipment deliveries that didn't make sense for farming. Some say he was building some kind of bunker or shelter." Raina had felt cold, despite the warmth of the courthouse. "I'm sure it's just small-town gossip." Mrs. Patterson's expression suggested otherwise. "Probably so, but after he died there were men asking questions around town. Government-type suits and badges. They cleared out whatever he'd been working on, or so folks assumed. The place has been empty since." Her hand reached across the counter, placing a business card atop the deed. "My nephew does handyman work if you need repairs. Tom Whitaker. Good man, doesn't ask too many questions." The drive to the property had taken Raina through countryside that grew increasingly isolated, the houses spaced farther apart, the roads narrowing from asphalt to gravel. She'd turned onto a driveway marked by a weathered wooden sign that still bore the name Anderson carved into wood, silvered by years of weather. The farmhouse sat on a small rise silhouetted against afternoon clouds. closer than the photograph suggested, more decrepit than she'd allowed herself to imagine. White clapboard siding weathered to gray patches, missing entirely to expose wood dark with rot. The wraparound porch sagged dangerously on the left side, its boards buckled and split. Windows broken or boarded, the ones that remained intact, filming over with grime and spiderwebs. Around the house, 15 acres of overgrown fields stretched toward tree lines thick with oak and maple. The red barn stood 100 yards away, paint faded to rust-brown roof, missing shingles in ragged patches. Smaller structures, a shed, and what might have been a chicken coop barely visible through grass that had grown waist-high. Raina had sat in her car for a long time, engine ticking as it cooled, staring at what she'd bought. A ruin. A desperate gamble that looked even more hopeless in 3 dimensions than it had in photographs. This was supposed to be her fresh start, her way of offering Claudia a home if she came back. This wreck of a building on land that screamed isolation and neglect. She'd climbed out of the Honda because there was nowhere else to go, her sneakers sinking into mud that spoke of recent rain. The porch steps creaked ominously under her weight. The key the county had given her turned smoothly in the lock despite the rust, as if the mechanism had been waiting for her, and the door swung inward with a groan straight out of every haunted house film she'd ever half-watched on sleepless nights. Inside, the air tasted stale and heavy. Dust hung in the shafts of light that penetrated the boarded windows, and cobwebs draped from ceiling corners like forgotten curtains. The wooden floorboards protested each step with groans and creaks that echoed through empty rooms. Raina had moved through the first floor in a daze, cataloging disaster. The living room held a moth-eaten sofa and a stone fireplace whose chimney probably needed rebuilding. The dining room was empty except for a table missing 2 legs and chairs scattered like the aftermath of some long-ago argument. The kitchen was worst of all, cabinets hanging off their hinges, a sink so rusted it looked actively dangerous, appliances that belonged in a museum of obsolete technology. A small study off the living room was the only space that felt intact, its built-in bookshelves empty but solid, a window that still had glass, a door that closed properly. Raina had stood in that room and felt her chest tighten with something between laughter and tears. 3,000 square feet of condemnation, 15 acres of isolation. This was what her life had been reduced to. This was the best she could offer her daughter if Claudia ever actually came home. She'd sunk to the floor, her back against the built-in shelves, and let the tears come. Great gasping sobs that felt like they'd been building for 8 years, for 10 years, for every year since Marcus had first looked at her with that distant expression that meant his mind was already somewhere else, with someone else planning an exit she'd been too blind to see coming. The floor was gritty with dust and probably mouse droppings. The walls were water-stained and peeling. The ceiling had cracks that suggested structural problems she couldn't afford to fix. But it was hers. Legally, irrevocably, catastrophically hers. When the tears finally stopped, Raina had pulled herself upright and climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, testing each step carefully. 3 bedrooms, just as the listing had promised. The master held a metal bed frame without a mattress and an oak dresser that looked solid enough to survive. The other 2 rooms were empty except for a child-sized rocking chair and one that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. The bathroom featured a clawfoot tub stained with rust and grime fixtures that hadn't seen water in over a decade, a mirror spotted with age. Raina had stared at her reflection in that failing light and barely recognized the woman looking back. 58 years old, alone, broke, desperate enough to buy a condemned house at a tax auction and call it hope. She'd descended the stairs more carefully than she'd climbed them, suddenly aware of how isolated the property was, how far from help if something went wrong. The sun was lowering toward the tree line, throwing long shadows across the fields. She needed to get back to her apartment, pack what little she owned, give notice to the landlord who'd been counting the days until she left anyway. But something pulled her toward a door she'd missed on her first exploration, half hidden in the shadows behind the kitchen. The door was heavy wood, the kind that spoke of older construction, and when she pulled it open, stone steps led down into darkness. The cellar. Every old farmhouse had one places to store root vegetables and canned goods through the winter. Raina had fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate rough stone walls and a dirt floor. Wooden shelves lined the walls, still holding dusty mason jars with contents she didn't want to identify. The air smelled of earth and something else, something almost metallic. She'd played the light across the space, about to retreat, when something caught her attention. The back wall didn't quite match the rest of the stonework. The seams were too straight, too deliberate. Raina had moved closer, running her fingers along what looked like a door disguised as part of the wall. Pressing experimentally, she felt a section give slightly under her touch. With a grinding sound that made her jump back, a portion of the wall swung inward a few inches, revealing not another cellar room but the beginning of a concrete tunnel sloping gently downward. Raina's breath caught. The walls were lined with gray-painted cinder blocks, metal conduits running along the ceiling. This wasn't amateur construction. This was professional military-grade work. She'd pulled the hidden door wider, her phone's light revealing a tunnel that extended at least 30 feet before making a turn. The air coming from the passage felt surprisingly fresh, suggesting ventilation systems still operating somewhere in the darkness. Mrs. Patterson's words came back to her. Some kind of bunker or shelter. Men asking questions. Government types. What had William Hayes been building beneath his farm? Raina knew she should stop. Turn around, call someone with authority to investigate whatever this was. But she'd spent 10 years being careful, being responsible, following rules that had gotten her nothing but poverty and loneliness. The woman who would have called the police died somewhere in the years between Marcus leaving and Claudia's silence. She stepped into the tunnel, her phone's light illuminating concrete walls and the conduits overhead. The passage descended at a gentle angle, the floor smooth beneath her feet. After the turn, the tunnel opened into a large underground room, easily 40 feet square with a ceiling 10 feet high. Raina stopped in the doorway, her light inadequate to the space before her. The room was finished with smooth walls painted institutional green. Fluorescent lighting fixtures hung dark from the ceiling. Metal shelving units lined one-wall desks with what looked like old computer equipment, filing cabinets painted government gray. Along another wall stood communications equipment, large radio transmitters with dials and switches, technology that looked decades out of date, but frighteningly sophisticated for a private installation. This was no storm shelter. This was a military facility hidden beneath a farmhouse that had looked abandoned and unremarkable from above. Raina moved deeper into the room, her phone's light catching on details that made her skin crawl. A large metal desk dominated one corner. She approached it, her hand trembling as she reached for a faded nameplate. Captain W. Hayes, USAF, United States Air Force. Not just military background, as Mrs. Patterson had delicately phrased it. Hayes had been an Air Force captain operating what appeared to be an official installation beneath his seemingly ordinary farm. A metal cabinet stood partially open nearby. Raina pulled it wider, finding stacks of folders with labels faded but still legible. She opened one at random, her light illuminating documents stamped with security classifications that made her hands shake. Blue Forest Monitoring Station Quarterly Report. The technical language meant nothing to her, but phrases jumped out. Aerial anomaly detection, unidentified intrusion tracking, atmospheric disturbance monitoring. What kind of monitoring station needed to be hidden underground on a private farm? Raina's light found a heavy door on the far wall, unlike the hidden entrance she'd used. This was clearly a security door with a keypad lock, though without power. The electronic mechanism sat inactive and the door stood slightly ajar. Beyond lay living quarters complete with bunks, a small kitchenette, bathroom facilities. Personnel had lived down here, perhaps for extended periods. Her foot knocked against something that skittered across the concrete floor. Raina directed her light toward the sound, finding a key ring with several keys and what looked like an electronic fob. She bent to retrieve it, her fingers closing around cold metal just as a distant sound reached her through the tunnel. Car engines. More than one. Coming down her driveway. Raina's heart lurched. It was barely 7 in the morning. Who would be visiting an abandoned farm at this hour? Mrs. Patterson's warning echoed in her memory. Men asking questions. Government types. She pocketed the keys with movements made clumsy by fear and hurried back through the facility, down the tunnel, up the cellar stairs. Her hand shook as she closed the hidden door, making sure it settled back into its disguised position against the stone wall. She emerged from the cellar into the kitchen just as the sound of vehicles grew closer. Through the broken window she could see them turning into the driveway. 3 black SUVs with government plates, their windows tinted dark. Raina's breath came fast and shallow. She'd been on the property less than 12 hours. She hadn't told anyone she was coming here early. How did they know the SUVs parked in front of the house, doors opening with synchronized precision? Men emerged in tactical gear, their movements coordinated in a way that spoke of military training. One carried what looked like sensing equipment. Another spoke into a radio. The lead man was older than the others, maybe mid-40s, with gray eyes that seemed to catalog everything they encountered. He approached the porch with purposeful strides, and Raina understood with sudden nauseating clarity that they weren't here by coincidence. They knew about the facility. They'd been monitoring it, and somehow they knew she'd found it. Raina moved to the front door on legs that felt disconnected from her body, opening it before the man could knock. She wouldn't let them see her afraid. She'd survived Marcus leaving Claudia's rejection, a decade of clawing her way back from nothing. She could survive this. The man stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his hand resting on something at his belt. His eyes took in the peeling paint, the broken windows, the desperation that must have been written all over her. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Ms. Lorraine Harlow. Raina's throat felt too tight to speak. She managed a nod. I'm Commander Daniel Price, United States Air Force Special Investigations Division. His hand moved to produce identification, which he held up for her inspection. We need to speak with you regarding this property. The ID looked genuine, but Raina had limited experience with military credentials. She forced her voice to work. What is this regarding? It's a matter of national security. Price's expression didn't change. May we come in? Raina's hands tightened on the doorframe. My house isn't exactly presentable. We're not concerned about the condition of your home. Ms. Harlow. Price's tone suggested this wasn't a request. We're concerned about what's beneath it. Behind him, one of his colleagues returned from the lead vehicle. A woman, maybe early 50s, with short gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She wore civilian clothes, slacks, and a blazer that looked expensive out of place against the backdrop of the abandoned farm. Ms. Harlow. The woman's voice was calm, clinical. I'm Dr. Victoria Stone, Department of Defense Science Division. Our records indicate you purchased this property yesterday at a county tax auction. Is that correct? Raina's mind raced through possible responses, discarding them all. Yes, it was legally transferred to me yesterday afternoon. Were you aware of the property's history when you made this purchase? The county clerk mentioned the previous owner was possibly military and somewhat reclusive. Raina kept her voice steady. That's all I know. Price studied her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The previous owner, Captain William Hayes, was an Air Force officer assigned to a specialized monitoring program. This property contains a decommissioned military installation that was never fully cleared according to protocol. Raina let surprise show on her face, not difficult given the scope of what she'd discovered underground. A military installation here, I had no idea. Ms. Harlow, I'll be direct. Price's tone sharpened. Our sensors detected an access event at this location early this morning. The hidden entrance to the underground facility was opened for the first time in over a decade. Given that you just took possession of the property yesterday, I assume it was you who found and entered the installation. The words hit Raina like a physical blow. Sensors. They'd had the facility monitored this entire time, waiting for someone to find it. The property had been a trap from the beginning. She could deny it, but the evidence was clearly against her. Yes, she forced the word out. I found a hidden door in the cellar this morning and investigated. I was trying to understand what I'd purchased. Did you remove anything from the facility? Raina thought of the keys in her pocket, the weight of them pressing against her hip. No. I just looked around briefly. It was dark, and I needed to get back to the city. Price and Stone exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Dr. Stone stepped forward, her expression softening slightly. What exactly did you see in the facility? Ms. Harlow. An office area with old equipment. Filing cabinets. Some kind of communications gear. Raina kept her description vague. There was another room with bunks and a small kitchen. Nothing that seemed particularly dangerous or active. Price nodded slowly. The Blue Forest facility was part of a classified aerial phenomenon monitoring network established in the 1980s. While officially decommissioned in 2013 following Captain Hayes's death, certain aspects of the technology and data collected there remained sensitive. Aerial phenomenon. Raina's confusion was genuine despite her fear. You mean like weather patterns? The terminology we prefer is unexplained aerial observations. Dr. Stone's voice took on a lecturing quality. Captain Hayes was stationed here to monitor and document unusual atmospheric and aerial events that might have significance for national security. The implications settled over Raina slowly, so absurd she almost laughed. You're telling me this property was used to watch for UFOs? We monitor various phenomena. Price's expression remained neutral. What matters now is securing and removing certain materials from the facility. Your cooperation would be appreciated. Raina's mind worked through the scenario unfolding before her. They wanted access to the facility. They had legal authority to insist on it. But they were asking, which meant they needed something from her. And what if I don't cooperate? The temperature in the conversation dropped perceptibly. Price's voice went flat. The property would likely be reclaimed under national security provisions. You'd be compensated for your purchase price, but you'd lose the farm. Raina felt a surge of protectiveness for this ruined house that had been hers for less than 2 days. Despite its condition, despite the military facility hidden beneath it, this place represented her last desperate bid for stability. A home where Claudia might come if she truly needed help, where they might begin to repair 8 years of silence. What about the facility itself? Raina asked. Will you be removing it completely? Dr. Stone shook her head. The basic structure will remain. It would be too disruptive to remove it entirely. We're only concerned with specific equipment and documentation. So I'd have an underground bunker on my property. Not precisely a bunker, Dr. Stone corrected. But yes, the living quarters and basic structure would remain intact, though I should note official access would be permanently sealed. One of the uniformed men emerged from the house and approached Price, speaking quietly. Raina caught fragments. The main console appears to have been accessed recently. The dust pattern suggests someone was searching through the command station within the past 24 hours. Price turned back to Raina, his eyes harder. The disturbance patterns suggest more than casual exploration, Ms. Harlow. Was anything removed from the command console? Perhaps a set of keys or access devices. Raina's hand wanted to move toward her pocket to confirm the keys were still there hidden. She forced herself to remain still. No, I didn't take anything. Maybe animals got in somehow. The place isn't exactly secure. Price didn't appear convinced, but he didn't press further. We'll be removing the sensitive materials today. Dr. Stone will remain to brief you on the non-disclosure agreements and address any questions you might have. Over the next several hours, Raina watched from the porch as the military team carried equipment and boxes of documents from the hidden facility to their vehicles. They worked with efficient silence, loading items into the SUVs with practiced movements. Everything from the underground installation disappeared into those vehicles piece by piece, erasing Captain Hayes's decades of work. By afternoon, Price declared the extraction complete. The facility has been cleared of classified material, he informed Raina. The entrance will remain, but we've disabled the electronic locks. You'll have access to the structure, but we recommend limiting time spent underground due to air quality concerns without the ventilation systems. As most of the team departed, Dr. Stone remained behind with a folder of documents. Let's go through these agreements. She spread papers across the dusty dining room table. The legal language was dense, but the implications were clear. Raina was prohibited from discussing the underground facility, its previous purpose, or Captain Hayes's military role with anyone. Violation would constitute a federal offense. As Raina signed the final document, Dr. Stone closed her folder carefully. For what it's worth, Ms. Harlow, I think you'll find this property has unexpected advantages. Besides a shelter during bad weather, Dr. Stone surprised her with a genuine smile. Captain Hayes chose this location carefully. The property has certain unique characteristics. You might find the soil particularly fertile, for instance. Before Raina could press for clarification, Dr. Stone glanced at her watch. "I should join the extraction team." She handed Raina a business card with just a name and phone number, no agency or department listed. "You have my contact information if any concerns arise." The final SUV pulled away as afternoon shadows lengthened across the overgrown fields. Raina stood on the porch watching dust settle on the gravel driveway, the keys from the underground facility still hidden in her pocket. The military hadn't found them during their sweep, which meant either they weren't as thorough as they appeared, or the keys weren't as important as Raina feared. The farmhouse felt different now, charged with secrets and implications she didn't fully understand. Captain Hayes had spent decades monitoring something from this isolated property. The government had maintained sensors on the facility for over 13 years after his death, waiting for someone to discover it. And Dr. Stone's comment about the soil being fertile suggested there was more to this place than abandoned buildings and overgrown fields. Raina pulled out her phone intending to call someone, though she wasn't sure who. The non-disclosure agreement prohibited her from discussing what she'd found. She had no friends close enough to confide in anyway. No family except a daughter who'd been silent for 8 years and a husband who'd erased himself from her life a decade ago. The isolation of the property pressed in around her. 40 minutes from the city, surrounded by fields and forest, with secrets buried literally beneath her feet, and military personnel who'd appeared within hours of her discovering them. This was supposed to be her fresh start, her way of offering Claudia a home if she came back. Instead, Raina had stumbled into something far larger and stranger than she could have imagined. And the keys in her pocket suggested that whatever the military had removed, Captain Hayes had hidden something they hadn't found. Something he'd left for whoever came after him to discover. 3 weeks passed before Raina allowed herself to believe the military wouldn't return. She worked through those July days with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned that survival required constant motion, patching the roof where rain had rotted through, replacing broken windows with glass salvaged from a hardware store's clearance bin, clearing debris from rooms that hadn't seen occupation in over a decade. Tom Whitaker. Mrs. Patterson's nephew proved as good as his aunt's recommendation. He arrived in a pickup truck held together more by rust than metal, surveyed the farmhouse with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen worse, and quoted her prices that suggested he understood exactly how broke she was. He rebuilt the porch supports, rewired the electrical panel so the lights worked without sparking, and replaced the kitchen sink without asking questions about the military vehicles that had surrounded the property during her first days of ownership. The garden had been Raina's idea, born from nights spent lying awake on the bare mattress she'd bought third-hand, staring at ceiling cracks and thinking about Claudia's letter. The soil behind the house was dark and rich despite years of neglect, easy to turn with the spade Tom had found in the shed. She planted tomatoes, herbs, flowers whose names she didn't know, but whose seed packets promised color. The physical work felt good, her hands in dirt, sweat on her back creating something instead of merely surviving. The county clinic where she'd worked part-time agreed to let her continue with adjusted hours, driving in 3 days a week to cover shifts no one else wanted. The commute ate gas money she couldn't afford to waste, but the paycheck kept her from burning through what remained of her savings. She needed to make this work. The farmhouse was all she had left. At night, after the renovation work stopped and the silence pressed in from the surrounding fields, Raina would retrieve Claudia's letter from where she'd hidden it in the nightstand drawer. The taped-together pieces felt fragile in her hands, the paper worn from folding and refolding. She'd read it until the words blurred, searching for some hint of the daughter she remembered in those spare, careful sentences. "I'm sorry it took this long to reach out. Not, I'm sorry for leaving. Not, I'm sorry for 8 years of silence. Just sorry for the timing, as if the years between them were nothing more than unfortunate scheduling." Raina had drafted responses a dozen times, crumpling each attempt. What could she say that wouldn't sound desperate or angry or both? That she'd bought a condemned farmhouse because it was all she could afford, that she'd discovered a military facility beneath it, that she'd signed documents prohibiting her from discussing any of it with anyone, including her own daughter. The keys from the underground facility sat in a jewelry box on her dresser, 3 conventional keys and the electronic fob, their presence a constant reminder of secrets she didn't understand. Commander Price's team had swept the installation thoroughly, but they'd missed these, which meant either the keys were unimportant or they opened something the military hadn't known to look for. Raina told herself she should leave it alone, focus on making the house livable, preparing for the possibility that Claudia might actually come. But curiosity gnawed at her during those sleepless nights. Captain Hayes had spent decades monitoring something from this isolated property. He'd hidden an entire facility beneath his barn. What else might he have concealed? The 4th week after the military's departure, Raina descended into the cellar again. The hidden door opened more easily now that she knew where to press, grinding less as it swung inward. The concrete tunnel felt less threatening in the beam of the heavy-duty flashlight she'd purchased, its walls solid and professionally constructed. The main room of the facility looked ransacked in the aftermath of the military extraction. Empty spaces on desks where equipment had sat. Filing cabinets hanging open, stripped of their contents. The communications console housing remained, but all the sensitive components had been removed, leaving only the metal shell. Raina approached Captain Hayes's desk with the keys clutched in her hand. The 3rd key on the ring slid into the drawer lock, smoothly turning with a click that sounded too loud in the empty space. Inside lay a leather-bound notebook, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. Raina lifted it carefully, finding beneath it a set of maps marked with symbols she didn't recognize, and a small device that resembled a smartphone but had no manufacturer logo, no standard buttons, just a smooth black surface with a single recessed button. She opened the notebook, her flashlight illuminating handwriting that was precise, but hurried the script of someone writing quickly to capture thoughts before they escaped. The first entry was dated August 15, 1989. 3rd sighting this month. Pattern recognition software confirming what I already suspected. These aren't random. They're responding to something in this region. The frequency is increasing. Command wants technical data, but they're missing the larger implication. This isn't reconnaissance. This is contact. Raina turned pages, watching decades compress into Captain Hayes's observations. December 1992. Command refuses to acknowledge the non-military implications. They only want to know if it's Soviet or Chinese. If they would just review the spectral analysis, they'd understand these signatures don't match any known aircraft or atmospheric phenomenon. July 2001. Permission to share findings with NASA denied again. Official stance remains atmospheric anomalies. 20 years of data says otherwise. I've documented 347 separate events, each demonstrating flight characteristics that violate known physics. The objects respond to human presence. They're aware of us. The entries grew more frustrated as years passed, Hayes's careful scientific observations bleeding into commentary about institutional blindness, about data being ignored because it didn't fit acceptable narratives. But the final entry, dated March 3, 2013, made Raina's hands tremble. They're shutting us down. Budget cuts, they say. But I know the real reason. Too much evidence accumulated. Too difficult to maintain the official narrative when you have 25 years of documentation showing consistent, intelligent interaction. I've secured the most important findings where they won't think to look. The land will protect the truth until someone ready to understand comes along. The soil itself has changed. They don't realize what that means. But someday someone will notice. Someone will ask the right questions. And maybe then the world will be ready to hear the answers. Raina sat back against the desk, the notebook heavy in her lap. Hayes hadn't just been monitoring unusual aircraft. He'd been documenting what he believed was deliberate contact with non-human intelligence. And he'd hidden his most significant findings somewhere on this property, protected by dirt and time, and the assumption that no one would care enough to look. The maps spread across the desk showed the farm and surrounding areas marked with various symbols. One location, circled in red ink, sat in the woods at the northern edge of the property line. Raina traced the route with her finger, estimating the distance at maybe half a mile through the forest. The strange device next smooth and featureless except for that single recessed button. The electronic fob from her keyring seemed designed to fit against a small panel on the device's back. Raina pressed them together experimentally, feeling them lock into place with a soft click. The device's surface flickered once, then went dark again. She needed power, or maybe a specific activation sequence, or both. Raina carefully replaced the maps and device in the desk drawer, but she carried the notebook back upstairs with her. Hayes's observations deserved more attention than she could give them in the sterile environment of the abandoned facility. She wanted to read them properly, understand what this man had seen over his decades of isolated vigil. That night, sitting in the study that had become her makeshift bedroom, Raina worked through the journal entry by entry. Hayes emerged from the pages as someone caught between duty and discovery, a military officer watching his superiors dismiss evidence that didn't fit their preferred reality. His frustration was palpable, but so was his dedication to documentation, to preserving what he'd witnessed, even if no one would acknowledge it. The technical details meant little to Raina. References to spectral signatures and electromagnetic anomalies beyond her nursing background. But the human story underneath resonated. A man alone watching the sky, keeping careful records, believing that someday the truth would matter to someone. She fell asleep with the journal open across her chest. Hayes's words blurring into dreams about lights in darkness and questions no one would answer. The sound of a car engine woke her just after dawn. Raina sat up, heart racing, the journal sliding to the floor. Through the window she could see an unfamiliar sedan pulling into the driveway, moving slowly, as if the driver wasn't certain they had the right place. The car stopped near the porch. The door opened. A woman emerged, moving with the careful deliberation of someone heavily pregnant. Raina's breath caught. She knew that profile, the shape of that face, even after 8 years of separation. Claudia. Her daughter stood beside the car, one hand supporting her swollen belly, the other shading her eyes against the morning sun. She looked up at the farmhouse, her expression unreadable from this distance, and Raina felt every year of silence compress into this single moment of reunion. She moved to the front door without thinking, her hand shaking as she pulled it open. Claudia turned at the sound, their eyes meeting across the overgrown yard. For a long moment neither of them moved. Raina took in the changes 8 years had written across her daughter's features. Claudia was 28 now, no longer the angry girl who'd packed her bags and walked out. Her face had lost its youthful softness, settling into angles that reminded Raina painfully of Marcus. But her eyes were the same, guarded and hurting in ways that time hadn't healed. Claudia climbed the porch steps slowly, one hand on the railing Tom had rebuilt just days before. She stopped 2 feet from Raina, close enough to touch but maintaining the distance they'd kept for years. Her voice when she spoke was rough with exhaustion and something that might have been shame. "Mom, I don't have anywhere else to go." The words hit Raina like a physical blow, 8 years of longing and hurt condensing into fury so sudden it stole her breath. She felt her hands clench, her jaw tighten, every cell in her body screaming the response that had been building since she'd torn up Claudia's letter. 8 years without a word, and this is what brings you back. Not love, not forgiveness, just desperation. You needed me so suddenly, I'm worth contacting again. Claudia flinched, her hand tightening on her belly. I know I don't have the right to ask, but you're asking anyway." Raina's voice shook. "You're standing on my porch, 7 months pregnant, after 8 years of silence, asking me to take you in because you have nowhere else. Do you have any idea what that does to me?" Tears started down Claudia's face, carving paths through makeup that couldn't quite hide the exhaustion beneath. "I'm sorry. I know I should have called sooner. I know I was wrong to stay away so long. But I'm here now. I'm here because I'm carrying your granddaughter, and I can't do this alone, and you're the only family I have left." The mention of a granddaughter cut through Raina's anger like a blade finding bone. She stared at her daughter's swollen belly, at the visible proof of new life growing there, and felt something shift in her chest. What about the father? Claudia's laugh was bitter, almost a sob. "He left when he found out. Just like Dad. Just like every man I've ever trusted." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I thought I'd learned from watching you. I thought I knew better than to count on anyone. But apparently stupidity runs in the family." Raina wanted to argue to defend herself against the implicit accusation in those words. But Claudia wasn't wrong. Marcus had left, and Raina had let her daughter watch it happen, let Claudia see her mother fall apart in the aftermath. She'd been so consumed by her own pain that she'd failed to protect her daughter from learning all the wrong lessons about love and trust and survival. "Come inside." The words came out harder than Raina intended. "We need to talk, but you shouldn't be standing in the heat." Claudia followed her through the door, moving with the awkward balance of advanced pregnancy. Her eyes took in the renovated study, the bare mattress, the boxes of Raina's possessions still unpacked against the walls. "You live here. In this one room for now." Raina kept her voice neutral. "The rest of the house needs work. I've been focusing on making this space livable." Claudia lowered herself onto the single chair Raina had salvaged from the dining room, her hand never leaving her belly. "It's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Raina heard the edge in her own voice. "You didn't bother checking on me for 8 years. For all you knew, I could have been homeless." The accusation hung between them, true and cruel in equal measure. Claudia's face crumpled, fresh tears spilling. "I thought about you every day. Every single day for 8 years I thought about calling, about writing, about showing up and apologizing for all the terrible things I said. But the longer I stayed away, the harder it got. And I was so angry at you, Mom, for staying with Dad when you knew he was cheating, for making me watch you break down after he left, for needing me to be your emotional support when I was just a kid trying to figure out my own life." Raina sank onto the edge of the mattress, the fight draining out of her. "I was wrong to put that on you. You were 20 years old. You should have been thinking about college and friends and building your own future, not taking care of your mother's broken heart. I blamed you for Dad leaving." Claudia's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I knew it wasn't your fault, but it was easier to be angry at you than at him. He was gone untouchable. But you were there hurting, and somehow that made me angrier, like you were weak for loving him, for not seeing what he was going to do. I was weak." Raina felt the truth of it settle in her bones. "I loved a man who didn't love me back, and I held on too long hoping things would get better. And when he left, I fell apart instead of being the mother you needed. I'm sorry, Claudia. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger." They sat in silence for a long moment, the morning light filtering through windows Raina had cleaned just days before. The farmhouse creaked around them, settling into the summer heat, and Raina could hear birdsong from the overgrown fields outside. Claudia's hand moved in slow circles over her belly. "I'm having a girl. I'm naming her Iris." "That's beautiful." Raina's throat felt tight. "When are you due? September?" "Early September if she comes on time." Claudia looked up, meeting her mother's eyes. "The father's name is Trevor. We dated for 2 years. I thought he was different. I thought I'd finally found someone who wouldn't leave. But when I told him I was pregnant, he said he wasn't ready to be a father, that this wasn't what he signed up for. He was gone within a week." Raina moved to kneel beside Claudia's chair, her hands hovering over her daughter's belly, before settling gently on her knee instead. "This time you're not alone. I don't have much. This house is barely livable. I'm working part-time at a clinic just to keep from going completely broke. But what I have you can share. You and Iris both." Claudia's hands covered Raina's, squeezing tight. "I'm scared, Mom. I'm scared I'm going to fail at this the way I've failed at everything else." "You're not going to fail." Raina heard the conviction in her own voice, felt it settle into certainty. "We're going to figure this out together, one day at a time." The healing between them felt fragile, a bridge built from apologies and need rather than true forgiveness. But it was a beginning. After 8 years of silence, Raina would take whatever beginning she could get. They spent the rest of that day moving Claudia's belongings from her car into the upstairs bedroom Raina had cleaned the week before. The room was sparse, just the metal bed frame and oak dresser, but Claudia seemed relieved to have any space at all. She unpacked slowly, her movements hampered by her pregnancy, hanging clothes in the dresser, arranging toiletries on the windowsill. That evening, as they ate dinner from containers Raina had picked up in town, Claudia looked out the kitchen window at the garden plot behind the house. "You planted vegetables. just tomatoes and some herbs." Raina followed her daughter's gaze. "The soil's better than I expected. Everything's growing faster than it should." Claudia leaned closer to the window, her eyes narrowing. "Mom, those tomato plants are huge. How long ago did you plant them?" 3 weeks, maybe?" "That's impossible." Claudia stood, moving to the back door. "Those plants look like they've been growing for months." Raina joined her daughter in the garden, seeing it through Claudia's fresh perspective. The tomato plants had indeed grown larger than seemed reasonable, their stalks thick and healthy fruit already forming in dense clusters. The herb plants sprawled across their designated space, lush and vibrant. Even the flowers Raina had planted as an afterthought bloomed with an intensity that seemed excessive for early July. "I thought it was just good soil." Raina touched one of the tomato plants, feeling the strength in its stalk. "Maybe there's something in the water from the well? Or maybe there's something weird about this property?" Claudia's voice carried an edge Raina couldn't identify. "You said the previous owner was military. What else did you learn about him?" Raina hesitated, the non-disclosure agreement heavy in her memory. Just that he was a recluse, kept to himself. People in town thought he was building some kind of shelter. The lie tasted bitter, but Raina couldn't risk violating the NDA by telling Claudia about the underground facility. Not yet. Not until she understood more about what Hayes had discovered and why the military still cared enough to monitor the property 13 years after his death. That night, with Claudia asleep upstairs and the farmhouse settling into darkness around her, Raina returned to Hayes's journal. She read about soil samples taken over decades, about measurable changes in composition that Hayes attributed to what he called proximity events. The more frequently the phenomena appeared above the property, the more the soil changed, developing characteristics Hayes couldn't explain through conventional agriculture or geology. He'd sent samples to laboratories using false names and cover stories. The results consistently showed mineral compositions that didn't match regional baselines, microbial communities, unlike anything in standard databases. Hayes had concluded the soil was being altered by exposure to something the phenomena generated, some byproduct of their propulsion system or energy signature that fundamentally changed the biochemistry of the earth beneath them. Raina thought about the garden growing impossibly fast outside her window, about Dr. Stone's cryptic comment regarding fertile soil. The military had known about this. They'd removed Hayes's equipment and documentation, but they'd left the land itself untouched because you couldn't extract dirt the way you could confiscate filing cabinets. The property was changing her vegetables, which meant it could be changing other things too. The air she breathed, the water she drank, her own body exposed to whatever strange chemistry Hayes had spent 25 years documenting. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, Raina felt a strange sense of wonder. Hayes had believed the phenomena were trying to communicate that their modifications to the soil represented some form of gift or preparation. What if he was right? What if this land was becoming something more than ordinary? Earth transformed by contact with intelligence beyond human understanding. 3 days later, Raina drove to the Pine Creek Agricultural Research Station with soil samples sealed in plastic bags. The facility sat on the edge of town, a modest building with attached greenhouses and experimental plots. Inside, a receptionist directed her to Dr. Nathaniel Brennan, the station's soil specialist. Brennan was younger than Raina expected, maybe early 40s, with red hair going gray at the temples and hands stained from working in dirt. He greeted her with genuine warmth, the enthusiasm of someone who'd chosen his profession out of love rather than necessity. New to the area. His accent carried traces of somewhere farther north, maybe Boston or Maine. "I recently purchased property in Pine Creek." Raina handed him the samples. "I noticed the soil seems unusual. I was hoping you could analyze it to help me understand what I'm working with." Brennan examined the bags with professional interest. "Where exactly is your property, the old Hayes place?" His expression shifted, recognition sparking behind his eyes. "The Anderson farm." "Interesting. That area has some unusual geological features. I'd be happy to analyze these for you." He logged her information into a computer, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "Basic testing is free for local residents. If you'd like comprehensive analysis, including microbial composition, that takes about a week." The comprehensive testing would be helpful. Rayna watched him work. Did you know William Hayes? Not personally. Brennan's tone stayed neutral, but something in his posture suggested he was choosing his words carefully. He was known to be private, though he occasionally contributed plant specimens to our seed bank. Quite knowledgeable about botany for someone with no formal training. This was the first Rayna had heard about Hayes having botanical interests. What kind of specimens? Unusual varieties. Brennan stood gesturing toward a door marked Authorized Personnel Only. Would you like to see our research greenhouse? We have some projects that might give context to your questions. The abrupt change of subject confirmed Rayna's suspicion that Brennan knew more than he was saying. She followed him through the building to a secured door requiring both keycard and code. Beyond lay a state-of-the-art greenhouse with automated systems controlling temperature and humidity. Plants in various stages of growth filled organized sections, each meticulously labeled and monitored by sensors. Brennan guided her to a secluded corner where plants with unusual geometric patterns in their leaf structures grew in isolated containers. These specimens originated from seeds Captain Hayes provided in 2010. Their DNA contained sequences unlike anything previously documented in botanical science. Rayna stared at the plants, noting their vibrant health despite the artificial environment. Are they dangerous? Not at all. Brennan's voice took on the quality of someone discussing a favorite mystery. But they demonstrate characteristics that shouldn't be possible. Photosynthetic efficiency 300% higher than natural plants. Ability to extract nutrients from seemingly depleted soil. Resistance to all known plant diseases. We've been studying them for years under the official guise of experimental hybrid development. He paused, studying Rayna's face. But you already know this property has unusual characteristics, don't you? That's why you're here. Rayna made a calculated decision. I found his journal, not the official reports, his personal observations. He believed the farm sat at some kind of intersection point. Brennan nodded slowly. A location where the boundary between our world and something else is particularly permeable. That was his theory. And his botanical research supported it. The soil from specific areas of your property has been fundamentally altered by exposure to something we can't identify or replicate. Did Hayes die naturally? Brennan's expression grew guarded. Officially, heart attack at age 68. Unofficially, there were circumstances that raised questions. He'd contacted several scientists, including my predecessor here, about going public with his findings. That was in February 2013. He died 4 weeks later. The implications settled over Rayna like frost. And then the military came and cleared out his facility. You know about the underground installation? Brennan spoke it as statement, not question. They conducted a decommissioning operation. All official records were removed. But Hayes had anticipated that possibility. He distributed aspects of his research to people he trusted. The agricultural elements came to us. Other portions went elsewhere. He pulled a business card from his pocket, writing a personal number on the back. If you discover anything else, anything you'd like a scientific perspective on, call me. No official reports, no government involvement. Just collaboration between people who want to understand what Hayes spent his life documenting. Rayna took the card, feeling the weight of what Brennan was offering. An ally. Someone who understood the significance of what she'd stumbled into and who wouldn't dismiss it as impossible or demand she surrender it to authorities. That weekend, Rayna and Claudia walked into the woods together for the first time in 8 years. The path was overgrown but still visible, suggesting it had been traveled frequently before Hayes's death. Claudia moved slowly, her pregnancy making the uneven ground treacherous, but she'd insisted on coming when Rayna mentioned wanting to explore the northern property line. What are we looking for? Claudia paused to catch her breath, one hand supporting her belly. Just getting to know the land. Rayna kept her answer vague. There's supposed to be an interesting rock formation out here. They found it 20 minutes later, a granite outcropping rising from the forest floor in a shape that did indeed resemble a turtle's shell. Claudia sat on a fallen log, grateful for the rest, while Rayna circled the formation, studying it from different angles. Hayes's map had marked this location with a red circle. He'd written coordinates in the margin along with a cryptic notation, Cache 1 primary documentation. Raina knelt beside the rock, running her hands over the ground around its base. Her fingers caught on something metallic beneath a layer of leaves and topsoil. She brushed away the debris, revealing a metal plate approximately 6 inches square, embedded in what appeared to be a concrete housing. "Mom, what did you find?" Raina's heart raced as she pulled the smallest key from her pocket, the one she'd been carrying since the day she found them in the underground facility. It slid into the lock in the center of the plate, turning smoothly despite years of exposure. The plate lifted on hidden hinges, revealing a waterproof container sunk into the concrete. Raina lifted it carefully, surprised by its weight. "Is that a buried treasure?" Claudia's voice held a mixture of amusement and curiosity. "Something like that." Raina stood cradling the container. "Let's get this back to the house before we open it." They made the return journey slowly, Claudia asking questions. Raina deflected with promises of explanations later. The container felt heavy with possibility, with secrets Hayes had deemed important enough to hide outside his official facility to protect even from the military that would eventually sweep through his life's work. That evening, after Claudia had gone upstairs to rest, Raina carried the container to the underground facility. She wanted to open it where Hayes had done his work, in the space he'd dedicated to understanding what others refused to acknowledge. The container was sealed with a sophisticated mechanism, waterproof and airtight. Another key from her ring unlocked it, the lid opening with a hiss of escaping pressure. Inside, cushioned in specialized foam, lay 3 items: a leather portfolio containing documents and photographs, a small metallic cylinder about the size of a pen, and a data storage device that resembled an external hard drive, but with connections unlike any standard format Raina recognized. She opened the portfolio first, her hands trembling. The photographs were extraordinary, crystal-clear images of lights and objects against night skies, some showing structured craft with geometric patterns, others capturing atmospheric phenomena with detailed instrumentation readings annotated in Hayes's precise handwriting. The documentation revealed a man driven by scientific rigor rather than conspiracy thinking. Hayes had methodically cataloged patterns, attempted communication protocols, developed theories based on observable data. His frustration with official dismissal bled through his careful prose. One analysis, dated July 12, 1998, made Raina's breath catch. These objects demonstrate technological capabilities far beyond current human achievement. The maneuvers recorded today would generate G-forces fatal to any biological pilot and impossible for materials known to our engineering science. The craft responds to human presence, altering course to avoid collision while maintaining observation distance. This is not surveillance. This is careful interaction with a species they're trying not to frighten. The metallic cylinder proved to be a sophisticated optical device. When Raina pressed what appeared to be an activation button, it projected a 3-dimensional star map onto the facility wall, certain systems highlighted and connected by lines that suggested routes or relationships. She quickly shut it off, overwhelmed by implications she couldn't begin to process. The data storage device presented the biggest challenge. Its connections wouldn't fit any computer Raina owned. But as she examined it more closely, she realized it might be compatible with the strange smartphone-like device she'd found in Hayes's desk drawer. She retrieved that device from upstairs, her hands shaking with anticipation. The connections matched perfectly. When she pressed the electronic fob against the receptor panel and connected the storage device, the screen illuminated with an interface unlike any operating system she'd encountered. Files appeared organized chronologically and by category: video recordings, spectral analyses, communication attempts. 25 years of diligent research by a man who'd dedicated his life to understanding phenomena his government refused to acknowledge. Raina spent most of that night absorbed in Hayes's work, watching video of lights performing maneuvers that violated physics as she understood it, reading his careful documentation of each event, his attempts to establish patterns and meaning. By dawn, she'd reached several conclusions that would have seemed insane before she discovered this property and everything hidden within it. Hayes hadn't been delusional. His research was meticulous. his documentation thorough, his conclusions drawn from observable evidence rather than wishful thinking. The farm sat at the center of decades of unusual aerial activity, and the soil changes weren't coincidental. Something about this location attracted the phenomena, and their repeated presence had fundamentally altered the land itself. The question was what Raina should do with this knowledge. She'd signed a non-disclosure agreement prohibiting her from discussing the Blue Forest facility, but these materials were Hayes's personal research discovered after the military's extraction. They hadn't known about this cache, which meant she wasn't technically violating any agreement by possessing it. But knowledge demanded responsibility. Hayes had preserved this information because he believed it mattered, because he thought someday someone would be ready to understand and act on it. Raina wasn't a scientist or a military officer. She was a 58-year-old nurse who'd bought a condemned farmhouse in desperation. Yet here she was, guardian of evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about humanity's place in the universe. Upstairs, she could hear Claudia moving around, the sound of water running in the bathroom. Her daughter was here, pregnant and vulnerable, seeking shelter in a house that sat atop secrets Raina was only beginning to comprehend. She couldn't risk drawing attention to the property, couldn't endanger Claudia by pursuing Hayes's research too publicly, but she also couldn't ignore what she'd discovered. Hayes had spent 25 years watching, documenting, preserving. The least Raina could do was continue his work carefully, quietly, until she understood what it all meant. She was returning from the underground facility when she heard Claudia's voice, sharp with alarm. "Mom, come here quick!" Raina ran to the kitchen, finding her daughter standing at the back window, staring at the garden with an expression between wonder and fear. The tomato plants had doubled in size overnight. What had been impressive growth before now verged on impossible, the stalks thick as saplings, fruit hanging in heavy clusters. The herbs had spread beyond their designated beds, and the flowers bloomed with an intensity that made them almost luminescent in the morning sun. "What is happening to your garden?" Claudia's voice shook. "This isn't normal. This isn't possible." Raina stood beside her daughter, looking at the evidence of transformation, and made a decision. She couldn't tell Claudia everything, not yet, but she could tell her enough. "I think the soil here has unusual properties. The previous owner was studying it. That's what I found in the woods yesterday, his research notes." "Research notes about soil?" Claudia turned to face her mother, skepticism clear on her face. "About a lot of things." Raina met her daughter's eyes. "This property has a strange history. I'm still trying to understand it myself, but whatever's affecting the garden, it doesn't seem harmful. If anything, it's making things grow stronger and healthier than they should." Claudia looked back at the impossible garden, her hand moving to her belly in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "Should we be worried about Iris?" "I don't think so." Raina spoke with more confidence than she felt. "But I'm going to keep investigating, and if I find anything concerning, we'll leave. I promise." The lie of omission sat heavy in Raina's chest. She was already concerned, already wondering what exposure to this altered soil might mean for a pregnant woman and her unborn child. But Claudia had nowhere else to go, and Raina wouldn't send her daughter back into the world alone and desperate. They would stay. They would figure this out together, and maybe in the process of unraveling Hayes's mysteries, they would also find a way to heal the wounds that 8 years of silence had carved between them. Dr. Brennan arrived at dawn, his face gray with concern that shifted to amazement as Raina described the garden's overnight transformation. "You understand what this means?" His hands moved in gestures that suggested he was trying to grab concepts too large for words. "Accelerated growth response. The soil isn't just altered, it's actively responding to cultivation. This goes beyond passive modification. They're still here." Raina heard herself say it, the conclusion she'd been avoiding. "The phenomena. They haven't left. They're still interacting with this land. Or the land itself has been changed permanently." Dr. Eliza Wong stood beside Brennan, already unpacking equipment from cases she'd brought. A physicist from the State University whose specialty was quantum mechanics and whose interest in Hayes's work had brought her here. The modifications might be self-sustaining at this point, continuing to amplify without direct intervention. Over the following days, they worked together documenting the garden, taking measurements, collecting samples. Wong set up monitoring equipment around the property, trying to capture whatever electromagnetic signatures she kept detecting. Raina contacted scientists. Brennan suggested people whose credentials were impeccable and whose willingness to examine Hayes's research spoke to how compelling his documentation was. And then, on a moonless night in mid-August, the phenomena returned. Raina woke to Iris crying upstairs, Claudia's voice soothing the baby back to sleep. She was about to drift off again when light flooded through her window, orange-red and impossibly bright, casting shadows that moved as the source descended. She was at the window before thought caught up to instinct, pulling the curtain aside to witness what shouldn't exist, but undeniably did. A sphere of light hovered above the farmhouse, easily 15 feet in diameter, pulsing with colors that shifted from deep red to brilliant orange. It descended slowly, the light it cast somehow gentle rather than harsh, like firelight, but impossibly bright. Raina's breath caught. This was what Hayes had documented for 25 years. This was what the military had tried to classify out of existence. And it was here now, above her home. She heard footsteps on the stairs, Claudia's voice urgent. "Mom, there's something outside. What is that light?" Raina turned to find her daughter in the doorway, Iris sleeping against her shoulder, both of them illuminated by the glow from the window. "That's what Captain Hayes spent his life watching." Raina's voice came out hushed with wonder. "That's what this property has been chosen for." They moved to the window together, watching the sphere circle the house slowly, its light making every detail sharp and clear. It hovered for perhaps 5 minutes before ascending, gaining altitude with impossible speed, until it was just another point of light among the stars. The silence afterward felt profound. Raina stood with her daughter and granddaughter, all three of them transformed by witnessing something beyond human understanding. Claudia's voice was barely a whisper. "They're real. Everything you've been researching, everything Hayes documented, it's all real." "Yes." Raina's arm went around her daughter's shoulders. "And they're still here, still watching, still, I don't know, still connected to this land somehow. What do we do?" Raina thought about Hayes's decades of observation, about his belief that the phenomena were trying to communicate, that humanity just needed to learn how to listen. "We keep watching, we keep documenting, and we wait to see what they're trying to tell us." That night marked a turning point. The phenomena had returned, confirming everything Hayes had preserved. And Raina understood with sudden clarity that her role wasn't to expose this to the world unprepared. Her role was to be the bridge between Hayes's work and whatever came next, to protect and preserve until the moment was right to share what this isolated farm had been teaching those willing to see. The land would protect the truth until someone ready to understand came along. Hayes had written that in his final entry, and Raina was beginning to understand that the someone might not be her alone, but her and Claudia and Iris together. 3 generations of women learning to heal while witnessing wonders that would change everything they thought they knew about the universe. The letter arrived during Iris's first week home, thick and official, the return address belonging to a law firm in Arlington that Raina didn't recognize. She opened it standing in the kitchen while Claudia nursed the baby upstairs, her hands still shaking from lack of sleep and the constant vigilance new motherhood demanded. Meridian Solutions Incorporated versus Lorraine Harlow. The heading made her stomach drop. She forced herself to read the legal terminology that followed words like receivership and federal jurisdiction and improper transfer swimming together until their meaning crystallized into something simple and devastating. They were trying to take the farm. Blackwood's company had filed suit claiming the underground facility made the property federal land that couldn't be sold at county auction, that her ownership was invalid, that she needed to vacate pending litigation. The walls seemed to close in around her. This house with its patched roof and salvaged windows, this land with its impossible garden and buried secrets, this was all she had, all she could offer Claudia and Iris. And now lawyers in expensive suits were arguing she'd never had the right to any of it. She climbed the stairs slowly, the papers heavy in her hands. Claudia looked up from where she sat in the rocking chair. Tom had repaired Iris's small mouth working at her breast, and the contentment on her daughter's face made what Raina had to say even harder. "We have a problem." Claudia's expression shifted as she read color draining from her cheeks. "They can't do this. You bought this place legally. The county sold it to you. The county didn't know about Blue Forest." Raina's voice felt hollow. Or maybe they did know and sold it anyway, figuring no one would care about an abandoned military installation. Either way, Blackwood has lawyers arguing we don't have legitimate claim. What do we do? Raina thought about Commander Price's careful neutrality about Dr. Stone's cryptic warnings about the non-disclosure agreement she'd signed that prohibited her from defending her ownership by discussing what made the property valuable. Fight, I suppose, though I don't know how we pay for lawyers when we can barely afford groceries. The letter from Blackwood himself arrived 2 days later, delivered by courier who required signature. The tone was cordial, almost friendly, as if the lawsuit was merely an unfortunate formality. $400,000 remained on the table. 30 days to accept before the offer expired, and they pursued the property through litigation she couldn't afford to contest. He'd included his private number invitation to call any time to discuss reasonable resolution. Claudia read it over Raina's shoulder, Iris sleeping against her chest in the carrier she'd taken to wearing constantly. "He thinks we'll just give up, that we'll take his money and disappear. Maybe we should." Raina hated herself for saying it. 400,000 would set you up for years. Iris could have everything she needs. You wouldn't have to worry about money while raising her alone. Is that what you want? To sell? Raina looked around the kitchen. They'd cleaned together the windows, letting in afternoon light that made the scarred countertop almost beautiful. "No, but I want you safe more than I want to be right. And fighting Blackwood means risking everything, including the roof over Iris's head. Then we fight smart." Claudia's voice carried conviction Raina hadn't heard since before Marcus left, before 8 years of separation had taught her daughter to expect abandonment. "We document everything. We reach out to people who can help. We make sure Hayes's research matters to someone besides corporations trying to profit from it." The decision solidified between them without formal agreement. They would fight. They might lose the farm eventually because Blackwood had resources they couldn't match, but they'd make sure his victory was expensive and public and came too late to suppress what Hayes had spent decades protecting. Dr. Brennan arrived that evening with Wong, both of them carrying equipment. They spent hours in the underground facility examining what remained, taking measurements, documenting anomalies. "This isn't just biological modification." Wong's voice carried excitement that made technical jargon sound almost poetic. "The electromagnetic signatures here don't match any known natural or artificial source. Whatever has been visiting this location operates on principles we don't have equations for yet. Can you prove that Claudia had followed them down, leaving Iris sleeping upstairs with a monitor? Can you show people this is real, that it matters? With time and proper equipment?" "Yes." Wong looked around the stripped facility. "But Meridian will bury this in proprietary research the moment they gain control. We need to document and publish before that happens." "How long do we have? The lawsuit requests immediate receivership." Brennan's expression was grim. "If the judge grants it, you could be forced out within weeks. Corporate attorneys know how to drag cases out for years, keeping you in legal limbo while they study the property. Then we work fast." Raina heard herself commit. "We gather everything. Bring in everyone who'll listen and make sure the world knows what's here before Blackwood can lock it away." The hearing for Meridian's receivership motion came faster than Raina expected, scheduled for a Tuesday in late August. She couldn't afford an attorney, so she stood before the judge alone, trying to argue against legal professionals whose billable hours probably exceeded her annual income. The courtroom was nearly empty. Just her and Claudia, with Iris fussing in her carrier. Blackwood's legal team, looking polished and confident, a bored clerk taking notes. The judge was a woman in her 60s who'd probably heard every argument about property rights. She listened to Meridian's attorney explain about classified facilities and federal jurisdiction, her expression revealing nothing. Then she looked at Raina with eyes that seemed to see too much. "Ms. Harlow, do you have representation?" "No, Your Honor." I can't afford it. You're aware Meridian claims the property contains federal installations that weren't properly decommissioned. I'm aware of their claims. Raina kept her voice steady. But I purchased the property legally at a county tax auction. The military had 13 years to assert federal interest, and they didn't. Do you have documentation supporting that Raina pulled out the letter Commander Price had sent unofficial, but carrying enough military letterhead to be persuasive? It confirmed Blue Forest's decommissioning. In 2013, confirmed all classified materials had been removed, confirmed the property posed no security concerns. The judge read it carefully. Where did you obtain this? Commander Price oversaw the final extraction. He provided it when I explained Meridian's arguments. Meridian's lead attorney stood quickly. Your Honor, this letter is hearsay, not official documentation. It's also not addressed to this court. The judge set it aside. However, it raises questions about Meridian's claims. She looked at Blackwood's attorney with visible skepticism. Does your client have documentation showing the facility remains under federal jurisdiction? The attorney's hesitation was telling. We're working with the Department of Defense to obtain records. In the interim, we're asking for temporary receivership to prevent interference. This is a farm counselor. The judge's tone was dry. How does the defendant living there constitute interference with a decommissioned installation? Without access to conduct assessment, we can't determine what remains of sensitive materials. You want her evicted so you can study property she legally purchased. The judge leaned back. That's remarkably convenient for your client's commercial interests. This is about national security. Then why isn't the Department of Defense pursuing this? The judge's skepticism was open now. Why is a private corporation claiming to act in federal interest while the actual government seems unconcerned? The attorney had no good answer. The judge watched him flounder, then made her decision. Motion for receivership is denied. The property remains in Ms. Harlow's possession until this matter is resolved. Meridian can pursue its lawsuit through normal channels, but Ms. Harlow won't be evicted without proper judicial process. Outside the courthouse, Claudia let out a sound between laugh and sob. We won. We bought time. Raina pulled her daughter into a fierce hug, careful of Iris between them. That's not the same as winning, but it's enough to keep fighting. The work intensified over the following weeks. Brennan brought colleagues from MIT and Stanford, people whose credentials were impeccable. Wong set up sensor networks trying to capture whatever the phenomena generated that human instruments could measure. Raina contacted journalists and academics, anyone whose interest might overcome skepticism long enough to examine Hayes's documentation. Claudia discovered she had a gift for translation, taking technical jargon and rendering it comprehensible without losing accuracy. She worked beside Raina despite Iris's constant needs, drafting press releases, coordinating with scientists. You're good at this. Raina's observation came out softer than intended. Making complex information accessible. I learned from watching you survive impossible situations by making people understand what you needed. Claudia didn't look up from her laptop. You taught me communication matters more than education. I never taught that deliberately. You taught by living it. Claudia met her mother's eyes. You think I didn't notice how you talked to doctors after my asthma attacks? You've been teaching me my whole life. I'm just finally old enough to recognize the lesson. The plan came together with speed that suggested desperation or destiny. They would publish Hayes's research simultaneously across multiple platforms, academic journals and mainstream media, overwhelming Blackwood's ability to suppress. They would include documentation of protective interventions, photographs of the impossible garden soil analyses showing impossible compositions. 2 weeks before planned release, Claudia went into early labor. It started as back pain she dismissed. By noon, contractions were regular. By 2, they were too close to ignore, and her water broke while walking from kitchen to living room. The drive to Pine Creek Memorial took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Claudia gripped the door handle, breathing through contractions that came faster than they should. Raina drove with one hand on the wheel and the other clasping her daughter's murmuring reassurances neither believed. The hospital was small, 15 beds, and a maternity ward that saw maybe 3 births monthly. The nurse who met them took one look and called for a wheelchair. 8 centimeters dilated. The doctor's voice carried concern he tried to hide. First babies usually take longer, but sometimes they have their own timeline. But it didn't progress smoothly. Labor stalled at 9 centimeters, Claudia exhausted from contractions that accomplished nothing. The baby's heart rate began showing distress, dipping with each contraction, recovering more slowly. "We might need to consider a cesarean." The doctor's voice was gentle but firm. "The baby isn't tolerating labor well." Claudia's face was pale with pain and fear, her hand gripping Reina's with crushing strength. "Just get her out safe. Please. I don't care how." Before they could prep for surgery, something shifted. Claudia's body made a decision, contractions intensifying with renewed force. The baby's head crowned, and suddenly everything happened at once. Nurses moving with coordinated urgency, the doctor calling instructions, Claudia screaming with effort from beyond exhaustion. Then Iris was here, tiny and furious and perfect, her cry filling the delivery room with proof of life. The nurse placed her on Claudia's chest, this impossibly small person with dark hair plastered to her skull and eyes squeezed against brightness. Reina watched her daughter hold her daughter, and something in her chest cracked open. 8 years of separation, 8 years of hurt and silence and stubborn pride dissolved in the face of new life, connecting them in ways words never could. Claudia looked up, tears streaming. "Mom, I'm sorry. For all of it. For leaving, for staying away, for blaming you. I was wrong about everything." Reina leaned down, pressing her forehead to Claudia's, her hand covering both her daughters and granddaughters. "I'm sorry, too. For not being strong enough when you needed me. For letting my pain become your burden." The apologies felt inadequate for 8 years of damage, but they were a beginning, and beginnings mattered more than perfect words. Reina stayed through the night, watching the baby sleep in the hospital bassinet, watching her daughter recover. In the early hours before dawn, when Claudia finally fell into exhausted sleep, Reina stood at the window looking at Pine Creek's darkened streets and made a decision. She wouldn't sell to Meridian. She wouldn't let Blackwood turn Hayes's life work into corporate profit. But she also couldn't keep this knowledge hidden forever while raising a granddaughter in a house that might be seized through legal maneuvering. Hayes had written the land would protect the truth until someone ready came along. Maybe that someone wasn't Reina alone. Maybe it was 3 generations together, Reina and Claudia and Iris. 3 generations of women broken and learning to heal. They brought Iris home 2 days later, Claudia moving slowly from difficult birth, the baby wrapped in hospital blankets. The farmhouse felt different, with an infant simultaneously more fragile and more important. Every creaking board, every drafty window became a potential danger needing addressing. But it also felt more like home than it had since Reina purchased it. Claudia's belongings mixed with hers in shared spaces. Baby supplies cluttered the living room. The sound of Iris crying and feeding created rhythms organizing their days. The publications went live at 6 that evening across 4 academic journals and 2 major news outlets. Within hours, social media erupted. Within 6 hours, government spokespeople issued carefully worded statements. Within 12, Reina's phone rang constantly with interview requests and scientific inquiries and messages from people who'd witnessed similar phenomena. The world didn't change overnight, but it started changing slowly the way paradigm shifts happen. Scientists who'd avoided unexplained aerial phenomena began publishing observations. Military personnel came forward with incidents they'd been ordered to dismiss. Civilian witnesses shared photographs and videos hidden for decades. And on a small farm in Pine Creek, 3 generations of women watched as attention focused on property they'd fought to keep. Commander Price and Dr. Stone arrived on a Thursday morning 6 weeks after the publications. They looked older, exhausted, in ways suggesting bureaucratic battles Reina would never hear about. "You've created quite a situation, Ms. Harlow." Price's voice carried resignation rather than anger. "The Department of Defense is being asked questions we can't answer without revealing programs that officially never existed." "Then maybe it's time to stop pretending." Reina met his eyes without backing down. Hayes spent 25 years documenting something extraordinary. Hiding it didn't make it go away. Stone surprised her with a genuine smile. He would have been proud, not of the chaos he hated attention, but of the courage to make his work matter. She pulled an envelope from her briefcase. "We can't officially support what you've done, but unofficially there are people in government who believe transparency serves security better than secrecy. Consider this documentation that Blue Forest was properly decommissioned and poses no federal interest. What about Blackwood's lawsuit? Meridian is being investigated for unauthorized access to classified information." Price's tone suggested satisfaction. "Their lawsuit will likely be withdrawn once they realize continuing means explaining how they learned about Blue Forest." After they left, Raina stood on the porch watching their vehicle disappear. Claudia joined her with Iris on her hip, the baby reaching for dust motes dancing in afternoon sun. "Is it over?" "The fighting, probably." Raina pulled her daughter close. "The attention, that's just beginning. But we have what matters. Each other. This land. Proof the universe is larger than most people imagine. What do we do with that? We keep documenting. We keep learning. We keep Hayes's work alive by continuing what he started." Raina looked at Iris. "And we teach the next generation being different. Being touched by extraordinary things isn't something to hide. It's something to embrace and share." 6 months later, on a March morning when frost silvered the grass, Raina stood on the porch watching Claudia and Iris play in the garden. The baby was 6 months old now, sitting up fascinated by everything, reaching for leaves and dirt with the absolute focus only infants possess. The farmhouse was different. Grants from scientific institutions had funded repairs, making it not just livable but comfortable. Researchers rented the underground facility 3 days weekly, running experiments Hayes would have appreciated. Claudia managed academic partnerships, proving as capable at organizing study protocols as translating technical language. Raina had become spokesperson for impossible truths. She gave interviews about Hayes, about the phenomena, about discovering you weren't alone. She spoke at conferences, wrote articles, answered questions from people desperate to believe there was something more. But these quiet mornings were best. Watching her daughter and granddaughter in the garden where lights had descended. 3 generations who'd been broken now healing in a house that had chosen them. Claudia looked up, catching Raina watching. "Mom, come see." Iris found something. Raina descended the steps. Iris held a small stone, turning it in chubby hands. Just an ordinary rock. But to the baby, treasure. Above them, morning sky was clear and empty. But Raina knew it wouldn't stay empty. The phenomena would return, drawn by whatever this land possessed. And when they came back, 3 generations would be here to witness, to document, to continue Hayes's work of understanding what it meant to live at the intersection between human reality and something vast beyond comprehension. "You gave me purpose back." Claudia's voice was soft. "I came desperate and lost. You gave me home, mission, reason to believe the future could be better. You gave me that too." Raina's arm went around her daughter. "You and Iris, you gave me family. That matters more than any discovery. The lights are extraordinary, but you're what makes this house home." That night, stars appeared one by one as darkness settled, and one brighter than others pulsed in pattern Raina recognized. Fibonacci sequence spelled in light across impossible distances. She stood at the window holding Iris while Claudia slept, watching that distant beacon. "We're here. We see you. Thank you for seeing us back." The star pulsed once more, bright and unmistakable, before fading into normal patterns. Raina Harlow, 59 years old, grandmother and nurse and guardian of impossible truths, smiled and carried her sleeping granddaughter upstairs, grateful beyond measure for the strange journey bringing them to this moment of belonging. The world was learning what Hayes had known. The universe was larger, stranger, more beautiful than comfortable assumptions allowed. And on one small farm in Pine Creek, 3 generations of women had found home, not despite the strangeness, but because of it. Some truths are too important to keep hidden, Raina thought as she tucked Iris into the crib beside Claudia's bed. And some families are worth rebuilding from fragments one day at a time, until the broken pieces become something stronger than what was lost. Outside, the March wind moved through fields where vegetables would soon grow with impossible vigor, where soil transformed by decades of contact with something beyond human understanding would continue feeding those who called this land home. And above, stars wheeled in patterns ancient and familiar, while one among them pulsed with rhythm suggesting intelligence vast enough to cross galaxies, yet patient enough to watch over one family, learning what it meant to belong. The land had protected the truth until someone ready came along. And that someone, those someones had found not just secrets worth preserving, but each other worth healing for. That was miracle enough for any life. More than enough for three women who'd survived abandonment and silence to discover that love, like truth, could be rebuilt from ruins if you had courage to begin again.